On va passer à présent à notre troisième et dernier panel. Merci beaucoup. Les suivants peuvent prendre place. Un dernier panel consacré à la prospérité et à la lutte contre les inégalités économiques. Alors, on va vous présenter toutes et tous. Certains sont avec nous en duplex, en direct. Nous avons Patrick TARAN. Voilà, vous pouvez déjà vous asseoir. Bienvenue. Vous êtes président du Global Migration Policy Associates, spécialiste des migrations internationales, ancien fonctionnaire à l'OIT dans le domaine des migrants. Bonsoir et soyez le bienvenu. Chantal PEYER nous rejoint. Bonsoir. Alors, vous êtes chef de l'équipe Entreprise et droits de l'homme au sein de l'ONG Pain pour le Prochain et vous avez évidemment joué un rôle important dans l'initiative multinationale responsable. Initiative, on le rappelle également, refusée dans les urnes, comme quoi la démocratie, des fois, ne va pas toujours dans le sens des engagements qu'on peut prendre, aussi noble soit la cause. Et bonsoir Raymond SANER. Vous êtes directeur du Centre for Economic Development C-Send et vous œuvrez de concert avec les Nations Unies pour la mise en œuvre des objectifs de développement durable au sein des entreprises. Comment améliorer les traités internationaux? Qu'est-ce qui existe déjà? Qu'est-ce qui reste à faire? Quel rôle peut jouer l'OCDE également en matière de gestion d'institutions financières? C'est très intéressant parce qu'on verra avec vous qu'un certain nombre de règles existent, un certain nombre de réglementations existent et qu'il ne reste plus qu'à les appliquer. Évidemment, c'est aussi souvent là que ça pêche. Et puis, nous avons avec nous en direct par Zoom Sangheon qui va nous rejoindre en fin de discussion pour une prise de parole conclusive. Et depuis le Mexique, évidemment, Andrea SANTIAGO. Alors, vous êtes avocate. Bonsoir, est-ce que vous nous entendez?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Et donc, on va parler avec vous de votre combat pour les travailleurs domestiques au Mexique, un combat très important que vous avez gagné. Vous avez permis, vous, en tant qu'avocate, d'assurer dans la loi une protection sociale pour les travailleurs domestiques au Mexique. Ça, c'est une victoire très importante. J'ai peut-être envie de commencer avec vous, Andrea SANTIAGO. Ça fait partie des bonnes nouvelles dans ces débats, c'est quand on a des résultats concrets d'un engagement. Et vous, c'est un engagement que vous avez vraiment mené de manière régulière, si je puis dire, puisque vous êtes allé vous battre devant la loi, devant la justice, et c'est la Cour suprême qui vous a donné raison. Racontez-nous cette aventure.
Yeah, well, I will highlight like 3 very important moments where I had the opportunity to participate in these major changes we had in Mexico in order to recognize domestic workers' basic rights. And the first one was at the beginning of 2018, when we saw a historic opportunity to push forward legal changes that were denying domestic workers' rights through the ratification of the ILO Convention 189. So the context was very strategic because we had the presidential elections very near. So the government at that time was leaving, and in 2014, that government had made a public promise to ratify the ILO Convention. So that was a key moment for the government in office to capitalize the ratification, and for us as organizations to strategically use this moment for our own purpose. So we had many allies, also many female legislators from different parties that were also supporting the cause. So we designed and we coordinated this strategy to ratify the ILO Convention before the presidential transition, and we joined efforts with other key organizations, and during 3 months, like very intensively, we worked in 3 main things. First, we carried out a campaign to raise awareness of the ILO Convention and its importance. We also met with key decision makers to show the economic and the social viability to ratify the ILO Convention. And also we carried out different symbolic actions with domestic workers to publicly demand the ratification. So in this month, our goal was not achieved at that time, despite the great support we had from diverse media, academics, civil society, and international organizations during this month. But in spite of all, we managed very important things. One is that for the first time in the presidential elections, the candidates were talking about domestic workers and the ILO Convention. Two, we implemented a very coordinated strategy that helps us to unite forces to make our voices heard. And also we gained many allies in the way. So after this, the second and very crucial moment I identified was in 2018, was the social mobilization we carried out in order to publicly protest against a court judgment that was denying domestic workers an equal access to social security. So with the alliances we have already built, and with the support of some journalists and human rights defenders, we managed and we made a great public noise to change this very discriminatory sentence of the court. And because of this public pressure and public mobilization, the court announced that a very profound review must be conducted, and after 2 months, the court announced a radical change. They declared unconstitutional that domestic workers were excluded to mandatory social security, and they gave the instruction to the Mexican Social Security Institute to implement a pilot program for domestic workers' access to social security, and they also established a period of 3 years to transform federal laws in order to guarantee mandatory social security for this sector. So we were super happy. I also have to mention the importance of Alfonso Cuarón's film Roma in this context. Of course, having him as an ally of the domestic workers' cause was also key at that moment. I would say that the last moment and crucial moment for defending domestic workers' rights being recognized by law was all the work we did with female legislators of all parties to transform federal laws that were still denying basic rights to domestic workers. So we sat with these legislators, we worked with them. We also analyzed the articles in the laws that were discriminatory. And finally, we presented the initiative to reform these laws with our support. So the reforms were accepted, and in 2019, domestic workers' rights were recognized by law. And finally, in December of 2019, the ILO Convention was also ratified once the political and social context had already changed profoundly, and the major changes in the law were already achieved. So I would say about these changes, like some of the learnings and some of the obstacles we face. One is that it is very difficult to have an impact in transforming legislations when there is no political will. And also when there are so many social demands and a context of race inequality. So whose voice is going to be heard when there are so many social exclusions? It's a challenge, it's a big challenge. However, I think that building alliances with different sectors and with different actors, even those alliances that you build inside the government, are key to have profound transformations. And also, one of the things we learned a lot was that constructing a closed narrative is fundamental in order to raise this awareness, because it is very difficult to talk about international conventions if we do not connect with people's realities. So in this sense, I think that there is also a very, it is necessary a pedagogical effort, and we need to build strong messages that can lead to individual and social reflection. And fourth, I think that it's very important to take advantage of historic opportunities. Cuarón's film at the moment, the presidential elections, all of the potential allies we had at the time. And I know that if we had not been there and if we hadn't been so persistent, it would have been very difficult to have the impact that we had in order to change this very discriminatory law. So I would say that. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Andrea SANTIAGO. On peut l'applaudir pour pour cette belle victoire, en tout cas, devant la loi. Patrick TARAN, une réaction, on parlait du rôle de la société civile hein, dans ces combats pour lutter contre les inégalités économiques. Cette société civile, elle a un vrai rôle, et après on entendra votre avis, Raymond SANER.
I think I'd like to start by just being a bit sharper on what we're talking about. For me, civil society and the civil society I've been working with now for literally 47 years is communities organizing around, and it's not prosperity, it's around survival. It's around justice. It's around community needs and making sure that people are treated equally, that their human rights are respected, that our communities' human rights are respected, and that people have a decent life and decent work. And I want to say in that context, and with that lead question and with what Andreas just said, that in my experience, it's about organization. It's not just mobilization or the street, which in some ways is the last step. It's about starting organizing week by week, day by day, month by month, year by year, organizing community, providing the knowledge that Adam sharing the knowledge and encouraging the community to build its own knowledge, as I think Adam said very eloquently a little bit earlier. And it's about agency, and I mean agency in the sense that it's not speaking for someone else. It's supporting our own communities to speak for themselves. And I think, Adiba, you very eloquently spoke about your role and about the role of people taking initiative in their communities and working with their communities. So it's not somebody else charitably from above saying, oh, we're going to help you poor, vulnerable people. It's about us helping and organizing ourselves and taking that. And I want to pick up on a question you asked a couple of other people to say, in my experience, what that can mean. And I'll just say decade by decade, an accomplishment or two that I've been involved with. In the 1970s, pushing the US government that wouldn't do so to actually admit 600 political prisoners out of the jails of Chile and bring them to the United States and resettle them so they could build a new life and become successful and continue to engage with their own country and with the country they came to. In the 1980s, I was part of a mobilization that literally stopped an invasion. You didn't hear about that because it didn't happen. But the US had fleets off of both sides of Nicaragua when the Sandinista elected government was in power. And I heard from, I would say, intelligence sources that I had some contact with, that some governments were afraid there was going to be a major invasion. We saw before in Vietnam from the US side, afterwards in Iraq. But it didn't happen because at one point, with years of work, of solidarity work, of community work, we were able to mobilize 250,000 people, 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. to say no intervention. And I think the result of that was that the government took notice and said there's going to be too much political dissension in our country if we go ahead with what they were going to do. In the 1990s, I was part of, and I was worked with the World Council of Churches at the time, I was part of building a global ecumenical movement that actually mobilized churches and other faith groups. In fact, we had a Muslim-Christian dialogue at one point about solidarity with migrants and refugees, and mobilizing faith communities to actually get succor and support for refugees, to support and advocate for the rights and the defense of migrants, and so on. And perhaps the most recent accomplishment was being co-founder and moderator of the steering committee for the promotion of the ratification of the Migrants' Rights Conventions, which got perhaps the most difficult of the 9, or most challenging of the 9 United Nations Conventions on Human Rights into force. When it was adopted, some government said it'll never enter force. It now has 55 ratifications, and here I'm talking about the International Convention for the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. And I think all of that, and I'll come back to a comment that earlier one of the panelists made, which is the question of alliance building and coalitions. It's not just one group or a few individuals. It's really mobilizing, organizing communities, building organizations that have a standing. And I would say 5 fundamental things are part of it. It's not only about knowledge, it's about values. It's organizing around justice. And I think Ocean made an interesting reference to that in the previous panel. It's about justice. It's about human rights. It's about community. It's about community welfare. It's about dignity and equality of treatment for everyone. And that's what people organize around. So I would just add then, it's about, as well, that agency. It's about inclusion. Also, Adam, I think, and other people in the first panel talked about the fundamental notion of inclusion. I'll leave it at that. It's just to push out some ideas on what we're talking about when we talk about civil society, about mobilization, about organization, and about the rights, dignity, and welfare of everyone on this planet.
J'ai envie de vous passer la parole, Raymond, puisqu'on parlait d'organisation. Voilà, vous connaissez très concrètement en quoi consiste l'organisation même des textes, des traités, un certain nombre de choses existent. Le chemin est encore long, évidemment, pour lutter contre les inégalités économiques, d'autant qu'aujourd'hui, on voit que la crise Covid n'a pas forcément amélioré la situation de ce point de vue-là. Mais est-ce qu'il y a un socle quand même qui nous rassemble, une direction dans laquelle on va? Est-ce que vous sentez cette énergie?
Je pense. Thank you. Je pense. Mais tout d'abord, je voulais dire, c'est un plaisir, Jérémy, de vous voir ici sur scène avec nous. En général, je vous écoute, je vous vois sur l'écran et j'apprécie beaucoup les émissions que vous avez organisées.
Merci beaucoup.
Et merci aussi pour les organisateurs de m'avoir invité de parler sur un sujet qui me tient à cœur. Et je vais continuer en anglais parce que je pense aux autres qui nous écoutent de loin. Et c'est un sujet où il y a aussi une certaine terminologie que je veux être absolument sûr que je ne vais pas confondre ce que je veux en fait passer comme message. So, yes, once upon a time, there was a certain gentleman called Milton Friedman. He got a Nobel Prize for being an excellent economist, one people thought at that time. And he came up with this saying, among other excellent books. He also coined the term, business is in business to do business. And that's all. Well, if we continue with this interpretation of what the private sector is all about, of course, we got a little problem. And that is, if it leads to profit maximization for the shareholders who own a company, then of course, all our discussions maybe are in vain. Because we know that some companies produce so-called externalities, right? They produce polluted water, air that we can't breathe. They say yes to work conditions which are horrible. There are certain things they are not obliged to improve or to do differently because there's no law which says thou shalt not do this extreme form of exploitation of nature as well as of human beings. Now, I'm not saying private sector and business are all evil beings who just are out only on making a buck and wanting to, stash money into their pockets and be profit maximizers. There are many decent, excellent business people who also bear in mind there is more to being in business than just to make money. A lot of them came up with the idea of corporate social responsibility. That is basically the idea that a company can also do good for society while at the same time be in business. It's not a contradiction. Right? However, as was the surprise of a gentleman called Emmanuel Faber, who was the CEO of a big transnational company called Danone. He was into corporate social responsibility. However, a small group of shareholders who really still kept with Milton Friedman's concept that the business is just there to make money, nothing else. The rest should be done by others, meaning society or maybe missionaries or whatever, who can take care of the damage caused if we don't take into account the whole idea of what business means. He got ousted in March, and immediately the share price of Danone went up by 2.3%, which of course is understandable to some extent. If the company does not anymore, quote, waste money doing corporate social responsibility, it will generate a higher profit, which could be beneficial for the shareholders. There's something about corporate social responsibility. There is the risk that some shareholders don't like it, or that the CEO gets replaced and the next one will go back to old-style business as business and nothing else. So people have thought about what could be done that's more consistent, more sustainable, and less dependent on one man or woman who has maybe great ideas, tries to implement it, but then gets ousted. So people have thought about it, including our governments. And the first initiative was 10 years ago at the level of the United Nations. There was this thing called United Nations Guiding Principles of what business should do in regards to respecting human rights. This has been accepted by all of the 193 governments, and in that sense, it's being implemented, or a lot of governments and countries try to implement these guiding principles. But there is also, of course, more to being a good company. To do good, to respect certain conditions which are good for the company and also for society. So there is something else called the OECD Guiding Principles for Responsible Business Conduct. It's a long formula, but basically it means also for business to respect, for instance, human rights. And in addition, it has a broader scope to also not engage in environmental pollution or activities which could harm the environment. Also not to practice corruption. Also, in that sense, not to use too much tax evasion to reduce the income that maybe local communities could expect from the activities of a transnational company. So, in other words, it's broader than the United Nations Guiding Principles. It's a bit more consistent than corporate social responsibility. But unfortunately, only 40 countries have signed up to it. There are still, the UN that means 193 countries. There are countries such as China. We think about China as a competitor. Well, to some extent, the idea of doing things more reasonably, more mindfully, to be sustainable. Of course, some companies, rightfully so, say, well, if we all do this, we'll have more costs, as I mentioned before with the CEO of Danone. So, why should we do all this when the Chinese and the Russians and all the others and the Indians, they don't practice the same rules? We'll become less competitive. So we'll have to further discuss how do we create something which makes sense for the survival of the planet, but also for the dignity of the people who are also practicing, of course, business, but also are in that sense consumers and also expect some certainty that we don't run into eco-suicide, but there is a future for the next generation. Now, things have further improved from my point of view. It's one thing to have good intentions, like corporate social responsibility. It's another to meet at the UN and to agree on treaties. But treaties like the UN and at the OECD are non-binding. In other words, nobody is obliged to actually implement them. They're meant to be good ideas. So the final step is what is now particularly happening in the Netherlands. The Netherlands are really ahead of us compared to other countries, including my own Switzerland. They have passed national laws. And based on national laws, one being, for instance, we, Netherlands, we have signed up to the Paris Agreement. So be it. Let's do it. They passed a law which expects companies to not be CO2 emissioner, to do things which I already now described to you about the OECD guidelines. They have now taken to court a big bank, for instance, ING. And ING had to accept that its annual publication, which reports about what the company is doing, was not good enough. Simply was a bit of greenwashing and bluewashing. That they would be more specific as to what they do in terms of trying to reduce CO2 emissions. And, which is never happened yet before anywhere else, that the bank itself, over the next 6 years, will gradually move out of investing in the coal industry. We had a similar rule also recently in the Netherlands about Shell. And Shell had to agree to reduce its CO2 emissions. I forgot, but I think 35% over the next 4 years. These are tremendous steps forward, from my point of view, to turn everything we talked about that we want to do to make the world a better place, to actually do it. And to let business, as well as society, know what is expected. So we are specific, and it helps investors and business to know what the rules are of doing business, and it's not just to be in business for business. That concludes my contribution.
Merci beaucoup, Raymond. On va donner la parole à Chantal PEYER, puisque vous sortez d'une campagne très intense sur la question des multinationales. Alors on sait que la Suisse abrite de nombreuses multinationales, le siège social de nombreuses multinationales, actives dans différents pays étrangers. Et donc vous, le combat, c'était finalement que les entreprises dont le siège social est en Suisse puissent répondre ici, devant la justice suisse, d'actes qu'elles auraient commis à l'étranger. Alors le texte n'a pas passé la rampe du peuple. Ça a été quand même une campagne très intense. Est-ce que la mobilisation autour de cette campagne vous a donné des résultats concrets? Est-ce que vous pouvez maintenant attendre des résultats concrets, même si la votation a été refusée?
Je vais parler en anglais. On m'a demandé de parler en anglais pour le panel, comme tous les autres intervenants parlaient anglais. First, I think it's important to understand that we actually won because we had a majority of Swiss citizens of 50.7% saying yes. And I think it's extremely important. We failed because we didn't have the majority of the states, which we need in an initiative. But this was made in the second wave of COVID crisis. And to have one citizen out of two in a country like Switzerland, where multinational corporations are extremely dense, and many people work in those corporations saying, we want laws so that those companies respect human rights and the environment also abroad, also in the Congo, also in China. I think this was really a huge change of state, of mindset for the Swiss citizens. And I think that was very important. What is a pity is that I think the political world hasn't understood that yet. I mean, our Conseil fédéral who now have done a counter project which we consider won't have the impact to really diminish human rights violation, and they have made a proposal on ordonnance how to implement their proposal. It will not be effective because what we came to the conclusion, and that's really a bit of follow-up of what you said, and we did research for years, many NGOs, and I mean all over the world. And what we saw is that those people in companies are not evil. It's just a system. And the system of the company, I mean, Friedman said the business of business is business. And what we hear often is that now CSR is win-win. If companies take care, it will be good for them. But it's not what we see on the ground. We do really research in the DRC, and years after years, I mean, subsidiaries of Swiss companies, they're owned by Swiss people, I mean, or at least by Swiss, they're based in Switzerland. They pour really polluted water into the rivers, or they have emissions which damage the health of the citizens or the communities living around. So, and we can do reports. We can do reports that are on TV, Swiss TV, sometimes BBC, but it doesn't really change the reality on the ground. So it's really a political debate. It's a debate that citizens have to say in which frame and with which rules can companies operate or not. And what we say is simply that it's an illusion to believe that they will do the right thing, not because they are bad people, because there is a system which is short-term. You have shareholders in those companies that want every 3 months a report. And Emmanuel Faber, and also the CEO of Unilever at that longer ago, said, I won't do financial report every 3 months, but only every 6 months. But I mean, that's the logic of those companies. And it's always been that the citizens say in which frame those companies, I mean, they are giants, they're more powerful than states today, can operate. And in that sense, to do now the link with the topic of the evening, citizen mobilization is absolutely central. And I think if there is one thing we can be proud about with this campaign on responsible business, is that we managed to mobilize the Swiss citizens, not just because we can have a vote when we have 100,000 signatures, but because we created local committees where people discussed about these issues. We had the churches, and this was afterwards a big polemic, but churches supported this change of the law. They put banners on the churches to say, yes, we want responsible businesses in Switzerland. We had people putting also banners on their balcony. So there was really a mobilization that was new. And one very important thing as well, we had money because a lot of citizens gave us money. And this money is not money because NGOs are rich. It's because really people gave us 10, 20, 30 francs because they wanted that we have money to do a good campaign. And I think that was really shows the power that even in a democracy like Switzerland, civil society can have to mobilize to change the law. Now the challenge, and I would also like to underline this, is when you start to become powerful, even in a really great democracy like Switzerland, because it's a great democracy, there are several people that don't like it. And what we saw, I mean, even in Switzerland, is that because we won 50.7% of the population, because we had gathered a lot of money to do this campaign, but it was money given by the citizens, we had a huge backlash in parliament against NGO a week after the vote. So we had 12 interventions in parliament where people and politicians said NGOs, even if they build a well in Africa, if they become money from the government, you know, to do solidarity project, they should not be allowed to take part in public debates anymore in Switzerland. And I think that's very preoccupying as well. And we also have to debate this, is that civil society has a very big capacity to mobilize. But there is also a lot of resistance, and there can be also a very, and that's a really worry at the moment, I think in the whole world, there is a shrinking space as well for civil society. And in many countries, not only to mention China, there is a huge backlash on civil liberties and the ability of civil society to mobilize.
Merci beaucoup, Chantal PEYER, d'avoir partagé avec nous ce témoignage. Le programme est avancé et il faut absolument donner la parole à Sangheon Lee qui est avec nous par Zoom. Alors, vous êtes directeur du département de la politique de l'emploi au BIT. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire de ces témoignages qu'on vient d'entendre?
First of all, I'm very happy to be at this meeting, and I want to thank the Alejandro for inviting me to this meeting. I just want to make 2 points based on the very rich and very constructive, actually, the conversation we have heard from this panel. Number one is, I strongly believe there is a growing need for the civil society and the social mobilization at all levels. Number two, and actually, there are so broad areas for the social society can do. So I just mentioned very quickly on these 2 points. The first, when we look at the globalization, we know the globalization is related to the economic inequalities, but at the same time, the evidence is very clear. The globalization is also associated with the centralization and also weakening the community and civil society in many parts of the world. This is Patrick's point as well. But if a recent book, for example, by the Raghuram Rajan, the former governor of the central bank in India, he actually published a very interesting book with the title of the third pillar, which actually refers to civil society. So his book has a very interesting subtitle, which says the revival of community in the polarized world. I think this theme was interestingly taken up by the former governor of the central bank, this time the UK, Mark Carney. I mean, there are some others. They're all talking about the same thing. To actually address the globalization and economic inequality, we have to find a way of reviving community and civil society. It's all clear. And global level, I hear the same thing. I think interestingly, I just heard the Sir Richard Jolley's point about the third United Nations. The third UN is actually the civil society. I completely agree on that point. I mean, right now, we have to find a way of reinforcing this power. This is very much echoed the Raymond's point about civil, the business and the CSR, and also Chantal's point about the ongoing tensions with the state, with the market, on the civil society. It has been always there. Right now, the overall civil society in some countries, Switzerland, remains strong, and not necessarily in other countries. It's really time to actually act upon it, especially as a way of addressing one of the crucial issues of the green transition and also economic inequality in general. The second issue I want to mention is that there are really broad range of the issues that civil society can make a difference on. I think Andrea mentions her excellent campaign on the domestic work, but I just want to complete that story. The very convention, the Convention 189 on the domestic work, adopted by the ILO, which was really thanks to the civil society themselves. I was sitting on the secretariat of the discussion on this very convention. I was just so impressed, sometimes overwhelmed with the strong voices from civil society. They are the ones who actually convinced the trade unions and also business and eventually the governments to support this international standard. In the beginning, we are all skeptical about this, but thanks to the huge mobilization from the civil society at the national level and the global level and also local level, this convention eventually came to reality. So this is one example. Another example is child labor. Global campaign on child labor is really the flagship program of the ILO. Once again, this is thanks to the civil society and all the global supply chain issues, for example, the good working conditions, safety and health in the global supply chain. Once again, without big support or big push from the civil society, we wouldn't have a very strong program and policies we have right now. The Raymond mentions about the very difficult situation with the business. What the civil society did in the case of the global supply chain, they brought in the consumers into the picture, and that's a way of realigning the business interest with actually the public or social interest, and then pushing for the government. At the local level, one interesting example is we are having really difficulty with the safety and health for workers. But here again, our local civil society, local community, they know the situation very well. They are working with the labor inspectors, for example, to provide a good way of resolving or improving the situation. And this is a good example of what actually Patrick mentioned, how we can bring in knowledges with the value and to make a difference. I think that's important. One last point I want to make very quickly is that we are now in a huge job crisis and crisis in the livelihood. Once again, I think civil society can work together with all different the peoples and to actually, to actually create a bit of the human-centered recovery for everybody. I think the civil society has done before, but now it's a bit context is a bit different. But I think it's a huge potential for the civil society. But to be honest, we need a civil society much stronger, more effective, and much broader than before. For actually this actually difficult time and also for the recovery. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Sangheon. Merci beaucoup d'avoir été avec nous. Merci aussi à Chantal PEYER, merci à Patrick TARAN et merci à Raymond SANER d'avoir participé à ce dernier panel.